So seller concessions allow you to pay less at closing to make buying a home more affordable. Good morning and welcome on my YouTube channel. Today we are going to talk and explain about seller's concessions. When buying a house, you pay fees called closing costs to cover the cost of getting the mortgage. Closing costs usually range from 2 to 5% of the home price. In some cases, you may be able to get the seller to pay for some of those closing costs. And of course, depends on the market, if there is a seller's market or a buyer's market. But generally speaking, there are so many cases that sellers are willing to pay some or to contribute in some of the buyer's closing costs. All these are called seller concession, and they can be powerful ways to save on your closing costs. Before you close on a mortgage, learn how to use seller concession to your advantage. So we are going to define seller concession. We are talking about what are those closing costs that seller concessions can cover. We are going to talk about the benefits and the drawbacks of the seller concession, and also in which kind of loans or mortgages the seller concessions are applied. So seller concessions are closing costs that the seller has agreed to pay. Sometimes you can ask the seller to contribute to specific closing costs. Other times, sellers may simply pay a percentage of the total closing cost without specifying them. So, what closing costs do seller concessions cover? The seller may be able to cover part or all of these closing costs. The first one is property taxes. You may pay for your property taxes through the end of the year at the closing, all right? So the other one is insurance. I'm referring to title insurance, which protects you and your lender if someone's come in the future to claim for the home's title. Other fees, the third, are loan origination fees. These origination fees cover your lender's charges for processing your loan. Also, there are inspection fees. Inspection fees cover the cost of inspections required for the loan. For example, in some states, a pest inspector may evaluate your property before a sale can go through. All right? Another fee is recording fees. The fee covers the expense of documenting your home's purchase with your local government. Appraisal fees. This covers the cost of getting a third-party appraisal of the home to determine the market value of the place that you are going to buy. We also have points, mortgage points, also known as discount points, which are an upfront fee you pay to reduce your interest rate. Once you apply for your loan, your lender will give you a loan estimate, which shows all your estimated closing costs. You can work with your real estate agent to decide which one to ask the seller to pay for. Let's talk about benefits and drawbacks of seller concession. So as you might learn by now, the seller concession are going to give you a break from the closing cost, which for buyer it's really higher in comparison to the seller's closing cost. So seller concessions allow you to pay less at closing to make buying a home more affordable. As a buyer, you usually have to bring at least a few $1,000s to the table for closing costs and your down payment. Seller concession can cut those costs significantly, so you do not have to completely empty your savings to buy a home. Agreeing to concessions can be good for the seller in some circumstances. For example, they can help the seller get their home off the market faster. If the seller is eager to close on the sale, they may be willing to pay part of the buyer's closing costs to speed up the process. So on the other hand, we have some drawbacks of seller's concessions. So asking the seller concession might make you less appealing buyer. Most sellers are looking for offers that don't have a lot of strings attached. If a home has, for example, multiple offers, the seller will probably disregard offers that include concession requests. In this example or instance, it may be better to put a lower offer for the home and cover the closing cost yourself. This option is easier for seller and may increase the chance your offer will get accepted. Now let's see how you can negotiate those sellers' concession, okay? And how you can communicate those requests to the seller. You know that you want to ask for concessions, but how do you convince the seller to help you pay? Asking for concession, it's all about negotiating and understanding the current house market. First, you'll need to figure out whether you are in a buyer's market or a seller's market. This will heavily influence your ability to negotiate for concessions. Sellers are much more motivated to offer concessions when their home has been sitting on the market for a while or when it's a buyer's market. If you decide to ask for concessions, limit your other demands. Sellers like to take the offers that's the least complicated for them. If you ask for concessions as well as repairs, replacements, and services, the seller is most likely to pass on your offer. If repairs are not an absolute must for you, consider offering a lower price and covering closing costs yourself. If you know you want to ask for concessions, we recommend working with a real estate agent. Your real estate agent can research local sales and tell you about your area's housing market. They can also find similar properties that closed with the concession. Presenting examples of recent seller concessions can motivate the seller to work with you on closing costs. If your real estate agent thinks you are in a seller's market, they can help you decide whether you should ask for the closing costs or put in a lower offer. Now let's see if there are any limits to the seller's concession. Your seller can't pay all of your closing costs. How much your seller can pay depends on the type of the loan you are getting and a few other factors. Keep in mind that the total amount of the seller contribute cannot exceed your total closing costs. For example, let's say you buy a home worth $200,000 with a conventional loan and a 20% down payment. In this case, the seller could legally contribute up to 6%, which is around $12,000. But if your closing costs are only $5,000, the seller can give you more money. Why are these limits to sellers' concessions? What's the point of setting limits on seller concessions? Well, mortgage rule makers set limits on seller concession to discourage inflation in the housing market. For example, let's say you want to buy a home worth $150,000. The seller offers you to sell the home for $175,000 and they offer you $25,000 for closing costs and tell you to keep anything that is left over. Even though that this might look like a nice deal for you, a good deal, it will cause local market prices, housing prices to go higher or to raise. When other sellers and agents see what the home sold for, the prices of other homes will go up to match the inflated market value. This cycle can quickly cause home and rent prices to rise to unsustainable levels. To avoid this, sellers are only allowed to contribute a small percentage of their home's value to closing costs. Seller concession limits by loan type. The restriction on seller concessions vary by loan type. The lender of the sale price of the appraised value usually dictates how much the seller can pay on concessions. For example, say you offer on a property for $155,000 and the appraisal of this property comes back to $150,000. So the seller has to pay up to 3% of the closing cost, and this 3% is calculated to the appraised market value of this property, which is $150,000. And the 3% of seller's concession comes up to $4,500 to help with the closing cost. Let's talk about the seller concession limits for some common loans. The first one is the conventional loan. The limits for conventional loans depends on how much you are putting down. If your down payment is less than 10%, the seller can contribute up to 3%. If your down payment is 10 to 25%, the seller can contribute up to 6%. And if your down payment is more than 25%, the seller can contribute up to 9%. If you are buying an investment property, the seller contribution is limited to 2%, no matter what your down payment is. Now let's talk about the FHA loans. For FHA loans, the sellers can contribute up to 6%. The seller can contribute up to 6% of the buyer's loan amount. This is the one loan type where the seller concessions are not based on the home price or appraised value, but just on the amount of the mortgage value. The other most common mortgage or loan are VA loans, which are the loans for the veterans. The VA loan rule dictate that the seller can contribute up to 4%, and seller concessions on VA loans may include payment toward a buyer's judgment on debts, as well as VA funding fees. Let's summarize what we talked up to now. So seller concessions are closing costs the seller agrees to pay. You can make a home more affordable for the buyer, and they can help the seller close the deal. Work with your real estate agent to decide whether you have a good opportunity to ask the seller for a concession. If the market is right, you may be able to ask for seller to pay for part of or all of your closing costs. You just have to make sure what you are asking for is within the limits dictated by the type of loan you are getting. And if you have more questions about the seller's concession, comment down down at this video, and I would definitely come back to you with questions and answer. And if you are a buyer that you are looking for, my suggestion is let a pro do the negotiation for seller concessions for you. Have a blessed day, and I see you soon.